Um, oh, we're not up to there yet. Okay. Okay. All right. So we're going to skip this long biurim. Um, okay, let's just look at a halacha from the Likutim Roe Behemadaka, that shepherds are people who are habitual ganovim, and therefore their status is lowered in the eyes of Chazal. And the Chazal made a special sort of disincentive for people to be shepherds. And they in Eretz Yisrael, where their animals would graze freely and steal from other people. And so they would basically say this person is really of a lower status within Jewish community, to the point where you don't even have to go to great effort to save their lives. Um, and okay, so based on that, the Likutim over here says, Roe behemadaka, ein megadlim behemadaka be'eretz Yisrael. This is on the bottom of Kuf Tzadi Beis, and we're going to turn to Kuf Tzadi Gimel in just a second. We do not raise small farm animals like goats and sheep in Eretz Yisrael. Why? Mipnei, and we skip to Kuf Tzadi Dalid, Mipnei shedarkom liros bisados shel achirim ve'ezekam matzot. Because it is common for them to graze in other people's fields, and they regularly cause damage. Vafilu babayis aser, and even therefore, if you kept them in your home, it would not be permitted. Vafilu im ein habehema shelo de ein adam chote velolo, and that's true even if the animal is not yours, you still are prohibited, because people generally don't sin unless they get some benefit out of it. But it's still going to be usher, because the animal tends to leave the house and go and damage. It's a concern that the animal would go outside and damage. And I refer you to what I write in the biurim, that that in the biurim, I guess he points out that there are certain circumstances in which we allow you to raise goats and sheep, and that's of course why there are goat farms and sheep farms in Eretz Yisrael. So and therefore, like he quotes from the Rashba, that it's only usher to raise the animals if you yourself are the shepherd, but if you hire a professional shepherd, then it's permissible. Um, so, yeah, yeah. So I mean, there are obviously heterim. If you ever want to become a shepherd in Eretz Yisrael, you can ask me the Shiloh. We'll do some research together. Yeah, raise goats and make goat cheese in the Golan. Okay, okay. So va'asr lahatzila mimavis, and you're not allowed to save people from death. Um, the Rambam writes in Perik Dalet in Halacha Yud Aleph Hilchos Rotzeach, Avol hagoyim she'ein beineinu uveinam milchama, Baroe behemadaka miyisrael v'chayotze bahen, ein misavavin lahen hamisa, va'asr lahatzilanim natu lamus ad kan lashona. He says when there's not a time of war, it's just that they're idolaters, okay, or if they're shepherds, you are not allowed to cause them death, but you're not allowed to save them from death either. He says, and this is what's quoted by the Beis Yosef, and then he quotes from the Knesset Hagdola, that when we say it's usher to save them, that's only in reference to idolaters. But with shepherds, there's no prohibition of saving them. And he just basically says that it's not so clear how you can bifurcate the two, how you can break them apart. But the bottom line is that non-Jews today do not have the same status as the Gentiles of old. Okay, so I just want to, I think we're going to go weiter, and we're going to look at Sif Yud now on page Kuf Tzadi Dalet. He says, V'chol zeh b'mumar l'tei avon. Up until now, what we've been talking about, where there's, we talked about a mumar, and we said that the only difference between a mumar and a regular person is a mumar, you have an obligation to save his life, to exert yourself, but you're not obligated to spend a lot of money in the process to do so. Whereas a regular Jew, you have an obligation to expend up to all of your resources in order to save their life. He says, "V'chol zeh b'mumar l'tei avon, aval misha avar avera lahachis afilu pameachas." But let's say a person violated a mitzvah in the Torah, did an avera, because they wanted to provoke God. They were angry at God, and they wanted to just show their dissent. So then even if they only did it one time, which is pretty harsh, kagon shahayu lefan of iser veheter shavim b'taman. Let's say, for example, a guy has kosher and non-kosher meat in front of him. They taste exactly the same. V'hiniach haheter v'ochel ha'iser lahachis. And he goes ahead and deliberately chooses the non-kosher meat to say, I'll show you how much I don't want to be a Jew. You have kosher meat and you have non-kosher meat. Give me the non-kosher meat. So hareze min. So this person qualifies as a min. And that's, basically a term that's used by the Gemara. V'haminim mi Yisrael, v'hapikorsim mi Yisrael. And these people that we call minim in apikorsim, v'heim shekofrim b'torah u'v'nevuah mi-Yisrael. And an apikoros is someone who theologically doesn't believe that there's divine authorship of the Torah and of prophecy. These people occupy a separate category. V'Yisrael shehemir la'avodas elilim afilu l'tei avon. Imlo hayanus, or a Yisrael who converts out of the faith to worship idols, like he becomes a Christian, even if he does it because of incentives that were provided. He fell in love with a Catholic girl, let's say, okay, but he was not under compulsion. O sheyachol livrach ve'eno boreach, or he could have fled and he didn't flee and he decided to convert to Catholicism instead. Okay, remember, this is in the medieval world, okay? So we're still in the medieval world. Mitzvah lahargan, im yesh biyado koach lahargan, b'farhesia horeg, b'imlav yovo aleim ba'aliyah lilos, ad sheyasaviv lahem hamisa. So in all of the aforementioned cases, it's a mitzvah to kill the guy. And if you can do it publicly to make a Kiddush Hashem b'rabim, nach beser. But if you can't, then just create circumstances to cause this guy something to happen to him. Below batlu dine nefashos bizman hazeh ela bebeistin. Aval elu misasim b'chol adam v'chol hakoydem zoche. But, and the only time we say that we don't carry out capital punishment anymore is only in Beistin. But outside of Beistin, if a person is liable for the death penalty, it still applies. And anyone who can chaperein, who can go ahead and do it, should do so. So this is shocking. It's astonishing, that there is such a strong language that is being used. But remember, this is not Bisman Hazet. We're not dealing with today. The problem that I have with this is that, and of course you can't excise text that is in the Shulchan Aruch. Problem that I have with it is, just imagine a person who's not stable getting a hold of this text and studying it in yeshiva, and then thinking that he's chayiv misa, that person's chayiv misa. I was just speaking to someone from another community last night, And he kept calling the other people in his community Rishaim. They're all Rishaim. And I said, what makes them Rishaim? What, because they're not community minded, or they don't have the same vision as you about how to build your small community? I mean, the problem is that there's a tremendous amount of, and the only term that I can think of is fundamentalism. That it's just, they look at a black and white text like this. There's no sense of nuance. There's no historical framing of it and putting it in its proper context. And they can, it can lead to very destructive things. So we have to, I think it's beneficial for us to know that this text exists. I think it's beneficial for us to study it. And then we have to look at the commentaries. And then and even after we've looked at the commentaries, we have to know how to put it in its proper context in the 21st century. So let's take a look at the Imrei Yaakov. Okay, so we just learned about there being a mitzvah to kill people. Okay, so let's take a look. If a person does even one sin in order to demonstrate that he wishes to anger his creator, Aveira lahachis, v'hu hadin da'asr lazuno ulefarnaso uliftoso im nishpa. Such a person, not only is there a mitzvah to kill, but it's also prohibited to feed them, to provide them with charity, or to save them, to ransom them if they are kidnapped and held for ransom. Afilu pam echas, and even if he does this one time, he's forfeited his life. This is different from a mumar that we talked about previously, who just does it because he's got a weakness for cheeseburgers, let's say. He says, in that situation, because where we said in the previous sif, you're not obligated to spend money to save his life. He says a person does not fall into the category of a lesser mumar just by eating a cheeseburger once. A person can have a moral lapse and have a weakness, and he is driving by a McDonald's one day and he's particularly hungry and he's all the way out in the middle of nowhere, and he just has this weakness and he does it one time. So that's not what makes you into a mumar l'te'avon, a mumar who eats or does sins because of a weakness, right? So you have to do it habitually in order to qualify as a mumar l'te'avon. Whereas a mumar lahachis, where you're doing it to anger God, all it needs is one time. V'hinei af sheharav kosav kan b'pshitus dafilu b'pamechas nasa mumar. He says, even though the Rav Shulchan Aruch over here qualifies you as a mumar by just doing this act of rebellion of mumar lahachis just one time, aval le'el simin dalet sif lametes kasav zeh b'sograyim mashma delo hayalo barur davar zeh. It sounds like in the previous chapter, chapter 4, where we learned this idea before, it sounds like it wasn't so clear to him because he wrote the words, even if you did it once, in parentheses, which is the Rav Shulchan Aruch's way of saying, I'm not so committed to this idea, I'm not really sure, but I'm going to write it anyway. So, Gama Chazon Ish, Kosav B'yesh Lahakel B'pachos Migimel Pa'amim. The Chazon Ish also said that if he hasn't done it 3 times, he doesn't really qualify as a mumar lahachis. Mihu ba'omer sha'ose lahachis. But if a person says explicitly, I'm doing this to anger my creator, efshir denasa mumar la'alter ad kan l'shana. But the Chazon Ish also writes, but if he says explicitly, I'm doing this to anger God, it could be he becomes a mumar immediately. So, it's funny, my sons have a friend who lives in Santa Monica who posts all the time on Facebook. He's a lapsed Lubavitcher chassid, and he's married to an Asian woman, and he loves Yiddishkeit, but he loves it in a love-hate kind of way. So he constantly is talking about it, showing up songs his friends write, to play Karl Bach songs, and what he'll do is he'll go on Shabbos to the Jewish neighborhood, and will film people in this while he's in his car saying, "Hey, I know that guy. That's a good guy." And they're walking home from shul and they're talesim coming out of the Chabad, like the 770 we have here. And you have in Lakewood, there's apparently a very large group of young men who have just feel disconnected. They've left Yiddishkeit and they gather on Shabbos afternoon and they do whatever they wanted, and apparently there's a lake in Lakewood. That's probably why they call it Lakewood. And that's where they gather on Shabbos afternoon. And the question, of course, is, do these people qualify as a mumar lahachis? Because they've decided knowingly, they know exactly what Yiddishkeit is, and they've left. And I've never found anyone who says that they qualify as a mumar lahachis. I just have never found it. I think we've written before that the Chazon Ish talks about, even in his time, that people are a tinok shenishba. But let's see. The achal ha'isr lahachis. He says an example of it is a person has two pieces of meat in front of him, one kosher, one non-kosher. They taste exactly the same. And he dafka picks the non-kosher to show that no one's going to tell me what I can and cannot eat. That's the definition of a mumar lahachis. So he says, dafka imachalo lahachis. He says that's only if he did it deliberately to show that he doesn't want to be part of the faith. He says, but let's say a person says, I don't care, just give me whatever you want, and he just decides it's not like he wants to make a statement, he just doesn't care. So after inyan shchita yesh amim dedino kemumar lahachis u'shchita sanavela mikol makom leinyan zeh ein dino kain. So when it comes to certain halachos, this person may be called a mumar lahachis. So, for example, the Gemara says that a mumar lahachis, if he shechts an animal, that animal is not kosher. Interestingly enough, if a person is just a mumar l'teyavon, his shchita is kosher, right? If let's say he's a guy who doesn't eat kosher because he has a weakness for cheeseburgers, okay? But he loves Yiddishkeit, is not trying to rebel against God, just he has a weakness for certain pleasures of life that are not permissible. So that person is allowed to be, is allowed to be a shaychet. That person's shchita is kosher, believe it or not. Yeah.
What about if they're sending like kosher meat, taking not kosher meal and sending it to?
Yeah, that's much worse. That's a chote umachtias arabim. Mordechai is asking the question: what if a guy sells meat under the false pretense that it's kosher, and is really selling treif meat? That's that's a guy. Can we kill the guy? That's a good question. We want to kill the guy. Certainly, in today's world, it would not be legal to kill him, but you should definitely try and get him in as much trouble as possible.
It's criminal, I presume. You're selling something under false pretenses, even secularly.
It is criminal. The Jewish community would be very justified in throwing the book legally at him and getting him in as much trouble, getting him incarcerated and in as much trouble as possible. But
I presume you're allowed, Rabbi, to go into secular courts for that?
yeah, because the secular courts has exclusive jurisdiction over the penal code, over penalizing its citizens. A Beis Din does not have jurisdiction to penalize today. So therefore, yes, 100%. Okay, so maybe we'll see an example of that later on. No, they're not considered. The people who accidentally ate treif, they're not a mumar at all. It's a person who eats non-kosher meat thinking it's kosher is not a mumar in any sense of the word. There have been stories over the years. We had a case in LA number of years ago where kosher butcher was getting in meat from the local supermarket, and yeah, it happens not all the time, but unfortunately it's happened enough so that we're familiar with the case. Yeah. Okay. So then he says, so he says, "Va'aftu shavek hetera va'achil isura shema eno osa lahachis v'shari lahatzilo mikol makom eno chayv." He says, and even though this guy is forsaking the kosher meat and eating the non-kosher meat, but he's not doing it to make a statement. It could be that he just doesn't care, and therefore he's not doing it as an act of rebellion, and therefore you're allowed to save his life, but you're not mechuyev to save his life. Another point, he says, v'da'od, the hamachal Shabbos b'terhesi l'teyavon. He says, if a person publicly violates Shabbos, even if he does it l'teyavon, which means he's not doing it as a rebellion, and just does it because he wants to, he says, shadino kinachri legabi kama inyanim, mikol makom ein dino kimumer lahachis ve'ein min hamoridin klal. He says that person does not have the status of a mumer lahachis, and therefore he just has the status of a regular mumer, a mumer l'teyavon, and therefore you're not allowed to do anything to bring him harm. The only thing is that you're not obligated to spend money to save his life. And aval hachazonish kasav de moridin also, achre'ela kamen sifkat pay masha kasafti sham va'ayin la'el simendalet sif lametes lagabe hashavas aveda masha kasafti sham. But he also says, but see what we're going to write later on in Sifkat and Pay, where we're going to quote. I'm sure he's going to quote the Chazon Ish later on. We'll just take a jump ahead. He says this halacha of meting out the death penalty to people who are a mumar lahachis applies to every single person. And therefore every person has the right to go ahead and kill a mumar lahachis. And the Rambam writes, "The ein tzarich lo edim v'lo hasra'a v'lo dayanim." You don't even need witnesses. You don't need to forewarn him. You just go ahead and take the law into your own hands. We have to be really grateful we don't live in those days. El kol hahoreg echad mehem asa mitzvah gedola veheser hamichshol. Anyone who kills one of these mumar lahachises has done a great mitzvah because they have removed the stumbling block from Israel. One of these converted Jews or one of these mumar lahachis. But nonetheless, it's necessary that it first be publicized that this guy is a heretic before anyone takes it into their hands to perform an execution. He says, "Kasav hachazonish, denira de'ein din moridin ela bizman shahashkachaso yisbarach geluya, kemo bizman shahayunisim mitzuyan, u'mishamesh baskol." He says, this whole din of being permitted to perform executions outside of Beis Din does not apply nowadays, says the Chazon Ish. It was only applicable at a time when God's providence was clearly manifest, when there were shahayunisim mitzuyin, when there were miracles prevalent, people recognized God, people heard the baskol, a heavenly voice, b'tzadikei hador tachas hashgacha pratis haniris la'in kol. And tzaddikim were under God's divine providence, and it was visible, it was palpable. And this guy who decides to rebel does so with all of the presence of God within the community, and only then and only then was it permitted to execute someone outside of Beis Din. The hakofrim az who be what's that word? Az who benelizus miyuchedes v'hatoyas hayetzer latavos v'hefkeros. He says, this fellow who therefore rebels against God in such a generation is in a unique situation of lowliness by allowing him to follow his Yetzer Hara. Va'az haya bi'ur rishayim gidro shel olam. And then, during those periods of history, removing the wicked from your midst was the way that you maintained propriety. Ki hakol yadu, ki hadachas hador mevi pur anios la'olam. Because everyone knew that when the generation becomes swayed to sin, that would bring suffering to the world. Umevi dever v'cherev v'rav ba'olam. And by allowing a sinner to remain in our community, we're just going to bring calamity to the world if we allow this person to survive. Aval bisman ha'helem shenichrisa ha'emuna min dalas ha'am. But at a time of divine hiddenness, when faith has been completely removed from the lower echelons of Jewish society, ein b'maaseh ha'hora de geder ha'pirtza ela hosafas ha'pirtza. Then killing people does not remove the problematic issue from our community, but it only compounds it. She'ihya beineihem kemaseh hashchasa va'alimus chas v'shalom. Because if people will see that, even members of your own Jewish community see you acting violently for the sake of God, that will only contribute to the Chilul Hashem, to the sense of that this person is just a religious fundamentalist and has gone nuts. The kaven shekol atzminu letakein ein hadin noheg b'shah she'ein bo tikun. So the only time that meting out violence against another Jew would it at any time be good is when it's creating a tikkun, when it's making some kind of rectification within society, right? So in other words, at a time when the general consensus of the Jewish community is we have to follow Hashem and we have to do the mitzvahs, and there's a general consensus that this guy is bringing us all down. We don't want this fellow's actions to bring calamity to the world, because we recognize that Hashem will get upset with us if we allow this evil to fester within us. So therefore, there's a mitzvah to kill him. But not today. That's not the attitude of most people today. Therefore, ve'aleinu lahachziram ba'avosos ahava. And therefore, today, the whole mahalach is to bring people back with the bonds of love. And to bring them, to bring illumination to them to the best of our ability, right? I'm not sure if all of our fellow Jews in other neighborhoods got the memo from the Chazon Ish. I think we have to remind some people about this Chazon Ish, but that's the, what? Yeah. So I'm glad that we jumped ahead, but we'll go through the rest of the Imrei Yaakov and Mirz Hashem tomorrow. So I hope that puts your mind a little bit at ease, because none of these halachas apply bisman hazeh. Okay? So we will continue Mirz